Year 1945. The war was over, but its echoes still haunted the hearts of millions. Across the battered landscape of Europe, the guns had fallen silent, yet the memories of suffering refused to die. In the aftermath of World War II, trains and trucks rumbled across borders, carrying not soldiers, but the broken, the displaced, and the defeated. Among them were women who had once worn the grey uniforms of the German military, nurses who had served on the front lines of horror, tending to the wounded and dying under skies of fire. They were prisoners now, captured, uncertain of their fate, and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to the very land they had been taught to fear. America. Every mile of that journey was heavy with dread. To them, the United States was the enemy, a land of victors who would surely seek revenge. But what awaited them on American soil would shatter every expectation they had carried from the ruins of war. In small hospitals scattered across the Midwest and East Coast, the women who once patched wounds for the Reich now found themselves treated as humans again. They were given food, shelter, and care, not as prisoners, but as people. It was a quiet act of mercy that stunned even the most hardened hearts among them. This is the forgotten story of captured German nurses and the unexpected kindness that changed their lives forever. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1945, the world was silent in ways it had never been before. The cannons had ceased. The sky no longer echoed with the hum of bombers, and yet deep within the hearts of those who had lived through it, the noise continued. For the young German nurses who had spent the last years patching wounds, watching men die, and holding the hands of soldiers far from home, peace did not feel like peace. It felt like uncertainty, like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for something to collapse beneath them. For weeks they had been held in temporary camps across the shattered landscape of Germany. They had been interrogated, processed, and classified by Allied officers who spoke a language they barely understood. They were told they would be transferred, but no one said where. Rumors spread quickly through the crowded barracks. Some said they were being sent to France to clear mines. Others whispered darker fates, punishment, prison, or even public humiliation. None of them imagined they would be sent across the ocean to the very country that had dropped the bombs that burned their cities to ash. In late June, the order came. A group of captured medical personnel, including nurses from various German field hospitals, were to be shipped to the United States. Their assignment: assist in post-war recovery hospitals under supervision. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Many didn't believe it. America felt like a myth, a distant land they had only heard about through propaganda and radio broadcasts that painted it as the land of arrogant conquerors, obsessed with revenge. But soon the trucks arrived. The morning of departure was heavy with grey clouds. The women were loaded into military transports, their few belongings clutched tightly in canvas bags. A photograph here, a small Bible there, the remnants of lives that no longer existed. The convoy rumbled across the ruined countryside toward the port city of Bremerhaven. As they passed villages reduced to rubble, the silence was suffocating. Occasionally, an old man would stand by the roadside, watching them with hollow eyes, neither pitying nor judging, just bearing witness to what war had done. When they reached the harbor, the smell of salt and diesel filled the air. American soldiers stood guard along the docks, their uniforms clean, their faces unreadable. A transport ship waited in the mist, its metal hull towering above the nurses like some enormous, indifferent beast. One by one they climbed the gangway, their boots clanging softly against the steel steps. None spoke. Some tried to look brave. Others quietly wiped tears, careful not to be seen. The sea stretched endlessly before them, grey, cold, merciless. For 2 weeks they crossed the Atlantic. The voyage was rough. Many of the women were seasick. Few slept well. They huddled in the lower decks, speaking in whispers, trying to guess what awaited them. Would they be treated as war criminals? Would they be paraded as trophies? The nurses had been trained to stay composed under pressure, to maintain dignity even in chaos. But nothing had prepared them for this uncertainty. Some prayed silently at night. Others simply stared into the metal walls, imagining the faces of patients they'd lost in field hospitals, young men who never got to see the end of the war. When land finally appeared on the horizon, the mood changed from fear to numb disbelief. America. The word itself felt unreal. As the ship approached the harbor, likely New York, though none of them knew for sure, the women pressed close to the railings, catching their first glimpse of a skyline untouched by war. Smoke rose from factories, but it was not the black smoke of burning cities. It was the smoke of life, of work, of a nation that had not been bombed into dust. The contrast was overwhelming. One nurse, barely 23, later wrote in a letter that she felt like a ghost sailing into a living world. The ship anchored and orders were barked. The nurses were told to disembark in small groups. The docks were crowded with American soldiers, Red Cross workers, and curious onlookers. The air buzzed with English words, too fast to understand. As they stepped onto solid ground, the women's eyes darted nervously from one face to another. They expected hostility, perhaps glares, maybe even insults. But instead, they were met with quiet professionalism. The Americans did not cheer, did not sneer. They simply moved with efficiency, checking lists, offering directions, and distributing water bottles and small paper cups of coffee. It was mechanical but not cruel. They were guided to military trucks parked nearby. The vehicles bore large red crosses painted over olive-green panels, the universal symbol of mercy. As the engine started, the nurses sat in silence, hands clasped tightly in their laps. Through the small openings in the canvas coverings, they caught glimpses of the American countryside rolling past. Wide roads, green fields, small towns that looked untouched by the nightmare Europe had endured. Children waved at the convoys as they passed. The nurses looked away, ashamed to meet those innocent eyes. Hours turned into days. The trucks carried them to different destinations, some to small towns in the Midwest, others to hospitals along the East Coast. Eventually, they arrived at what they were told was a civilian internment medical unit. Expecting barbed wire, guards, and harsh orders, they hesitated as the doors opened. But what they saw made them freeze in place. A hospital. A real hospital. Not a makeshift military ward filled with dying men and blood-stained cots, but a clean white building surrounded by trees, sunlight spilling across its lawn. The American Red Cross flag fluttered in the breeze. Nurses in crisp white uniforms moved in and out of the entrance, carrying charts and trays. It looked like another world entirely. One untouched by war. Inside, the hallways were quiet, polished, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen. Every surface gleamed. The German nurses stood awkwardly in the lobby, clutching their documents, as an American matron approached. Her hair was neatly pinned, her face calm and professional. She spoke slowly, using simple English. "You will be assigned to quarters. Clean clothes, food, then rest. Tomorrow, we begin work. No threats, no lectures, no hatred. Just instructions." That night, many of them couldn't sleep. They lay on soft beds with real mattresses, something most hadn't felt in years, and stared at the ceiling. The silence was alien. In Germany, nights had been filled with the sound of distant bombings or the cries of the wounded. Here there was only stillness. Some of the women wept quietly, not from sadness, but from confusion. How could the enemy show such restraint? The following morning, they were given fresh uniforms, plain white with Red Cross insignia. They weren't prisoners in chains. They were nurses again. Each was assigned a small role in the hospital, some in wards, caring for recovering soldiers, others in laundry or kitchen duties. The Americans supervised but never mocked. They corrected mistakes gently, provided translation help when needed, and even shared smiles from time to time. The shock of kindness was almost painful. One nurse described it years later as the strangest form of punishment imaginable, to be treated better by your enemy than by your own officers. These women, who had worked under the rigid hierarchy of the German military, were suddenly surrounded by a culture that valued order but allowed warmth. Each day began early. They would line up for breakfast, coffee, eggs, toast, meals that felt almost extravagant after years of rationing. The first few mornings, most of the German nurses could barely eat. They thought it was a trick. Yet as days passed and no cruelty came, their guarded hearts began to soften. The Americans were curious but polite. Some soldiers avoided eye contact at first. Others offered hesitant greetings. Over time, the tension eased. The language barrier remained, but gestures filled the gaps. A shared nod, a smile after a task done well, a silent thank you after a patient's recovery. The women began to sense something they hadn't felt in years: dignity. In the evenings, they would gather quietly in their quarters. They talked softly in German, reflecting on the surreal contrast between their expectations and reality. They had prepared for punishment, not compassion. Yet here they were, in a place where the beds were clean, the food was plentiful, and the people, the supposed enemy, treated them as professionals, even as human beings. And still, there was guilt. Every kindness reminded them of the faces left behind in ruins. Every smile carried an echo of grief for the cities that no longer existed. But perhaps that was part of the healing. The slow realization that humanity could survive even the ugliest of wars. By the time autumn arrived, many of the nurses had adapted. They worked diligently, followed orders, and learned fragments of English. Some even began to laugh again, tentatively, as if rediscovering something long forgotten. The Americans noticed. One matron later remarked that the German girls worked with a kind of quiet hunger, not for food, but for normalcy. It was during one of those early autumn mornings that a young American orderly, noticing the hesitant expression of a German nurse, handed her a cup of hot cocoa from the cafeteria. She hesitated, then took it, whispering a soft "Danke." It was a small act, but it bridged a chasm that bombs and bullets could never fill. By winter, the German nurses were no longer merely prisoners of war. They were participants in an unspoken reconciliation, one built not through politics or speeches, but through daily acts of decency. They had arrived in America expecting hatred. What they found was something infinitely more powerful: mercy. Days in the American hospitals passed differently than anything the German nurses had ever known. The first mornings were tentative. They walked the white, sterile corridors with cautious steps, glancing at patients who lay in neat, orderly rows on clean cots. Many of the soldiers had seen combat, but here, in these hospitals far from the battlefields of Europe, they were not in immediate danger. Their wounds were healing, both physically and mentally, and the nurses were astonished by the calm that filled the wards. The air smelled of antiseptic, linen, and the faint aroma of coffee from nearby kitchens, a stark contrast to the stench of blood, sweat, and mud they had grown accustomed to in European field hospitals. They were assigned to simple duties at first, delivering trays, tidying beds, organizing bandages, tasks that felt mundane yet carried immense responsibility. Each movement, each interaction seemed imbued with a quiet significance, a reminder that life continued even after the war. At first, many of the German nurses struggled with disbelief. How could this be the land of the enemy? How could men, who had been taught to see them as enemies, offer a smile, a gentle word, or a helping hand? One nurse recounted later that on her first day, an American soldier reached out to take a tray from her hands. She flinched, expecting anger, sarcasm, or insult, but he merely nodded politely and thanked her. The simplest gestures, handing over a bowl of soup, adjusting a pillow, or fetching water, seemed miraculous. It was not that the soldiers and staff were overtly heroic or theatrical in their kindness. It was the quiet consistency of it that left the deepest mark. No one shouted, no one demanded loyalty, no one reminded them of their place as former enemies. Instead, they were treated with an unspoken respect, almost as if their prior service, in whatever uniform, had been irrelevant in the presence of human need. As weeks became months, the German nurses began to settle into a rhythm. They learned the layout of the hospital, the routines of the staff, and even small phrases of English, which allowed them to communicate better with both patients and colleagues. Slowly, their nerves calmed, and a sense of purpose returned to their work. They observed with amazement how the Americans treated even the simplest aspects of care as important, making sure every patient had warm blankets, a clean cup, and enough food to eat. The nurses themselves had often rationed supplies, worked with scraps, and watched soldiers die from preventable conditions. The contrast was almost unbearable to witness. One evening, a nurse sitting quietly in the corner of a ward remarked that the soldiers here seemed almost pampered, but not in a frivolous way. They were cared for as humans, with dignity and patience, and it was this dignity that seemed foreign, yet intoxicating to the German staff. The kindness of the Americans was not limited to simple hospital duties. They took the time to teach, to explain, and even to joke gently. A doctor might pause to show a nurse a new technique, taking extra care to ensure she understood, while an orderly might smile as he handed over a tray, giving a nod of encouragement. The German nurses, trained in the discipline of rigid hierarchy and often harsh commands, were unaccustomed to such patient guidance. Yet in this environment, mistakes were met not with scolding, but with instruction, not with humiliation, but with encouragement. It was a foreign concept, and slowly it began to reshape their understanding of what it meant to care for others. Food, which had once been rationed to near starvation levels, became an almost ceremonial part of the day. Breakfast, lunch and dinner were served on trays with neatly arranged plates, bowls of soup, warm bread, and occasionally a small treat like fruit or jam. The German nurses initially approached these meals with suspicion, uncertain whether such abundance could truly be offered freely. Many took small portions at first, hesitant to indulge, unsure whether they were allowed or if it was some form of trick. Yet day after day, the meals continued. No lectures, no fines, no reminders of enemy status. Slowly, the women began to eat with less hesitation, allowing themselves to feel nourished after years of deprivation. The act of eating itself became a healing ritual, a reminder that survival was not merely about endurance, but about being cared for and, in turn, learning to care for others again. One of the most profound experiences for the nurses was seeing American soldiers who had fought in the war. Men who had lost friends, brothers and comrades, treat them with kindness instead of vengeance. Initially, there were glances of caution, barely hidden, as the nurses moved among the beds, adjusting blankets, taking temperatures, or handing out food. But over time, those glances softened into smiles. A soldier might nod in thanks, or offer a brief comment on the weather, or even share a quiet story of home. These interactions, small as they were, carried enormous emotional weight. The nurses, trained to expect hostility, had their assumptions shattered daily by these subtle, yet undeniable gestures of humanity. Even within the hospital wards, moments of connection flourished unexpectedly. A German nurse might find herself seated beside a recovering soldier during his therapy session, exchanging a few words or helping him with a simple task like tying his shoes. She would see his gratitude, hear his laughter, and realize that the enemy had become a patient, a person, a fellow human being deserving of care. The moral and emotional complexity of these interactions was profound. Many of the nurses began to question the narratives they had been raised on, that all Americans were cruel, or that every victory for them meant pain for others. Here, in these quiet halls filled with the soft scent of antiseptic and the gentle clatter of medical instruments, the war's binary lines began to blur. Over time, some of the German nurses were entrusted with more responsibility. They began to assist in medical procedures, observe treatments, and even offer advice from their experience on the battlefield. American staff encouraged them to share their knowledge, to contribute and to take pride in their skills. This trust, once unimaginable, became a source of profound internal conflict for some of the nurses. They had been trained to serve a nation whose policies and actions had caused immense suffering. Now they were being valued for their expertise, independent of political affiliation or past loyalties. It was disorienting but liberating, allowing them to reclaim a sense of professional identity that had been eroded by war. Even outside of formal duties, moments of simple humanity reinforced the surreal nature of their experience. In hallways, they might witness a nurse offering a blanket to a shivering patient, or an orderly bringing a cup of tea to someone too weak to rise. In shared spaces, laughter would occasionally break through, a small, innocent sound that reminded the nurses that life continued even after unimaginable horror. They learned to observe, to imitate, and eventually to participate in these gestures of kindness. Slowly, they began to see themselves not as captives or survivors, but as contributors to healing. By midwinter, the German nurses had started to form quiet bonds with the American staff. These connections were not formalized, not spoken about openly, but existed in the small gestures: a smile, a shared cup of coffee, a brief conversation in broken English. The nurses began to feel the first sparks of trust since their capture, tentative yet growing. They understood that this trust would not erase the past, but it offered a fragile bridge towards something like reconciliation. As months passed, the nurses began to experience joy again, small joys, yet significant. A warm blanket on a cold morning, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a soldier's gentle thanks, or a nurse's laughter echoing down the hallway. The routine of caring for others, in an environment built on respect and compassion, reshaped their very understanding of duty. They were no longer just performing tasks. They were part of a larger ecosystem of human care, one that transcended nationality, ideology, and war. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of this experience was the way it forced the nurses to confront their own humanity. Years of war had demanded emotional suppression, detachment, and endurance at all costs. Here they were invited, implicitly, gently, insistently, to feel again, to care, to nurture, to accept care in return. These small acts of empathy, repeated day after day, became transformative. The German nurses began to emerge from the shadows of trauma and suspicion, slowly reclaiming a sense of self that had been buried beneath fear, fatigue, and loss. By the time spring arrived, the nurses were no longer merely observers. They were active participants in the hospital community. They knew the patients' names, understood their routines, and contributed meaningfully to their recovery. They had learned to trust, and to accept trust in return. It was not an easy process, nor was it complete, but the trajectory was undeniable. Compassion had begun to heal wounds left not only on the soldiers, but also on themselves. The experience of these German nurses in American hospitals stands as a testament to the power of human kindness in the aftermath of conflict. It shows that care, patience, and respect can bridge even the deepest divides. The nurses had arrived expecting hostility and were met with mercy. They had braced for punishment and were given trust. They had prepared for fear and found security. In this environment, healing extended beyond the body to encompass the spirit. And though they would eventually return to Germany, they carried with them a profound lesson that even in a world scarred by war, acts of humanity can flourish, reshaping hearts and minds in ways that weapons never could. As months turned into a full year, the captured German nurses began to understand the profound impact of their experiences in the American hospitals. Initially, each day had felt like an anomaly, a strange, almost surreal sequence of events in which kindness replaced hostility, guidance replaced suspicion, and trust replaced fear. But over time, the patterns became clear. These were not isolated gestures, but a sustained commitment to treating them as human beings, rather than mere remnants of an enemy army. Slowly, a realization began to take hold that the world was far larger, far more nuanced than they had ever been led to believe. Here, mercy and compassion were not weaknesses, but strengths and the power to forgive, to nurture. and to uplift held more weight than any uniform or flag. The nurses began to notice subtleties they had previously ignored or never encountered. The Americans they worked with had suffered their own losses, yet there was no lingering bitterness directed at those who had been labeled the enemy. One nurse recalled observing an orderly carrying a young soldier's tray to a recovering patient while simultaneously offering a gentle, reassuring word to a German nurse who hesitated with her duties. These simultaneous acts, small yet profound, highlighted a fundamental truth that the nurses had struggled to internalize. Human kindness could exist even in the midst of great pain. And importantly, it was not conditional upon loyalty, nationality, or political allegiance. It was simply the right thing to do. The process of realization was gradual, often accompanied by intense emotional struggle. For years, these women had internalized a rigid, militarized worldview that victory belonged to one side and that the other side deserved punishment, atonement, or at the very least, suspicion. Each act of American decency challenged that worldview. Every meal offered freely, every patient handed over with trust. Every gentle correction from a supervising nurse felt like a quiet revolution, a dismantling of assumptions built over decades of upbringing, propaganda, and war. Some of the nurses would later write that the first time they truly understood this, they felt a wave of guilt mixed with relief, guilt for doubting the humanity of those they had been taught to hate, and relief for discovering that reconciliation was possible. Even in the most unlikely places, these emotional transformations were reinforced by the daily routines of hospital life. Nurses began to participate more fully, gaining confidence in their abilities, while also observing the compassionate rhythms of the American system. When caring for soldiers, they saw firsthand how genuine attention to small needs, a warm blanket, a comforting word, a moment of patience, could transform recovery. And they realized that their own contributions were meaningful. Their hands, trained to treat pain and injury, were being trusted again. Their eyes, once accustomed to assessing life and death on chaotic battlefields, were now encouraged to observe subtle changes in patients' conditions with precision and empathy. Slowly, the act of service became an internalized source of pride and purpose. The relationships formed between the nurses and American staff were subtle yet profound. Bonds developed not through grand gestures or formal ceremonies, but through small, shared moments. A joke whispered in the hallway, a shared cup of coffee during break, an encouraging nod after completing a challenging task. These interactions were unremarkable on the surface, but they carried deep significance. For the nurses, they represented proof that trust could exist across borders, that cooperation could transcend former enmities, and that the world could contain spaces where individuals were valued not for their nationality, but for their character and skill. These small human connections formed a scaffolding for broader emotional rehabilitation. Over time, the nurses began to reflect on the nature of war and mercy. They had seen enough death, starvation, and despair to understand the depths of human cruelty. Yet here, in a controlled and compassionate environment, they were witnesses to the opposite spectrum, to patience, understanding, and forgiveness. The act of caring for others while being cared for in return revealed a transformative truth. Power need not be measured in destruction or dominance, but could also be measured in healing and empathy. One nurse later described it as learning a language of the heart that war had tried to erase. The psychological impact of these experiences was profound. Many nurses, initially guarded and withdrawn, began to experience emotions they had suppressed for years. Laughter returned, tentative but growing stronger with each passing week. Tears came more freely, no longer only in mourning for lost comrades or destroyed cities, but also in gratitude for unexpected kindness. Some nights, sitting quietly in the hospital dormitories, they would write letters home, struggling to put into words the inconceivable juxtaposition of their past and present lives. They wrote about the confusion of being treated as professionals rather than prisoners, of receiving sustenance without expectation of servitude, and of seeing Americans as allies in human dignity rather than enemies. These emotional awakenings were complemented by small but poignant moments of shared humanity. A nurse might help an injured soldier sit up, only to have him return the gesture with a reassuring touch or a smile. During downtime, some nurses began to learn small details about American life, the names of towns, family traditions, or favorite foods. These exchanges were modest, yet they symbolized the breaking down of cultural and ideological barriers. They were learning that personal identity and professional competence could coexist with kindness, and that trust could be rebuilt even in those who had been trained to fear it. As the months progressed, some of the nurses were given opportunities to teach younger American nurses techniques learned in German military hospitals. They felt a mix of pride and incredulity. Once, these same skills had been used to tend to soldiers in a war that now seemed almost unreal. Now the same knowledge was being shared in an environment of cooperation and mutual respect. Their expertise was valued not for national allegiance, but for its practical worth in preserving life. These teaching moments reinforced a sense of purpose, giving them agency in a world that had often made them feel powerless. Eventually, the reality of repatriation approached. Letters arrived announcing the arrangements for their return to Germany. A complex mix of emotions surged among the nurses. Relief at returning home, fear of reintegration into a country still recovering from war, and profound gratitude for the time spent in the American hospitals. The lessons of mercy, compassion, and reconciliation they had witnessed were not easily abandoned. They had internalized a worldview that acknowledged the possibility of goodness, even amidst past horrors. The prospect of returning to Germany did not erase the months spent learning that humanity could survive the harshest circumstances. It amplified their understanding that reconciliation, when genuine, could leave lasting scars of healing rather than trauma. On the day of departure, the farewells were quiet but heartfelt. The nurses hugged the American staff they had worked with, exchanging brief words and gestures that carried the weight of months of shared labor, laughter, and recovery. Some tears were shed, not from fear or anxiety, but from gratitude. They were leaving a place that had redefined their understanding of human kindness, a place where they had been seen not as captives, but as professionals, as women, and as individuals worthy of care and dignity. As they boarded the ships bound for Germany, many of the nurses looked back at the hospital grounds one last time. The buildings gleamed in the afternoon sun. Corridors they had once walked hesitantly, now familiar and almost comforting. Faces flashed before them, patients who had survived because of their care, American colleagues who had mentored and guided them, and moments of quiet, shared humanity that had changed their hearts forever. They carried these memories like talismans, proof that mercy could flourish, even amidst the ashes of conflict. The journey back was filled with reflection. The nurses understood that the war had ended, but its lessons were ongoing. They had seen cruelty, but they had also witnessed compassion, destruction and yet restoration, loss alongside renewal. They had entered America as captives, unprepared for the depth of empathy they would encounter. And in that empathy, they discovered a form of freedom that no chains, no bars, and no political allegiance could ever provide. It was the freedom to trust, to care, and to embrace humanity, a lesson that would resonate far beyond the borders of any nation. Years later, many of the nurses would recount these experiences in letters, diaries, and private conversations. They described the profound shift that had occurred in their hearts, a movement from fear to understanding, from suspicion to trust, and from captivity to a quiet yet transformative liberation. The realization that mercy and kindness could exist even in the aftermath of war became a guiding principle in their lives, shaping relationships, careers, and perceptions of the world. They had witnessed firsthand that compassion was not weakness, but a power capable of bridging divides that war had sought to cement. In the end, the experience of the German nurses in American hospitals serves as a testament to the enduring power of empathy. It demonstrates that even in situations defined by conflict and mistrust, the human capacity for understanding, forgiveness, and care can prevail. The nurse's journey, from fear and suspicion to recognition of shared humanity, illuminates the possibility of reconciliation in its most profound sense. Their story is not merely one of survival, but of transformation, a quiet, enduring reminder that acts of mercy can resonate across time and borders, shaping lives in ways far greater than any act of war.